Imagine a world before hospitals, before medicine, before people even understood what sickness was. A child wakes up with a burning fever. Their family gathers around the fire. No wounds, no visible danger. Yet something invisible is already inside. Thousands of years ago, someone became infected for the very first time in human history. And nobody knew that moment would begin a war humanity is still fighting today. But here is the question. What if the first virus never came to us? What if we entered its world? To understand the first human virus, we need to travel back further than civilization, further than language, further than humanity itself. Long before humans walked across continents, long before cities and kingdoms existed, the Earth already belonged to another kind of survivor. Viruses. Entities so strange that even today, scientists still debate whether they should be called alive. They do not breathe. They do not eat. They cannot reproduce alone. And yet, they have survived for billions of years. Before the first human opened their eyes, viruses had already crossed oceans of time. They moved from cell to cell, from creature to creature. Changing. Adapting. Waiting. Then one day, something happened. A new species appeared. Curious. Social. Fearless. Humans. And somewhere in that forgotten past, one invisible encounter changed everything forever. Today, scientists believe the first human virus may never be identified with certainty. There may be no fossil, no ancient record. No forgotten cave drawing, only traces left inside us. Fragments hidden in our DNA, a silent reminder that the oldest battle in human history may have started long before humans ever knew they were fighting. When people imagine humanity's oldest enemy, they usually think of predators. Sharp teeth. Claws. Wars. But the truth may be far stranger. Our oldest enemy may have existed before the first tree, before the first animal, before the first human ever took a breath. To understand where viruses came from, we have to go back to a time so distant that Earth itself was almost unrecognizable. More than 4.5 billion years ago, our planet was not blue. There were no oceans. No oxygen. No life. Only oceans of molten rock, violent impacts from space, and a sky hidden behind endless clouds of ash. If someone had looked at Earth then, they would have seen a dead world. But hidden inside that chaos, something extraordinary was beginning. Slowly, the planet cooled. Water condensed. Rain fell. Not for days. Not for years. Possibly for millions of years. And eventually, the first oceans appeared. Silent. Dark. Endless. Those ancient waters would become the stage for one of the greatest events in the history of the universe. Life. Though no one knows exactly how it happened. Maybe lightning triggered chemical reactions. Maybe minerals on the ocean floor assembled the first biological structures. Maybe tiny molecular systems learned, for the first time, how to copy themselves. But at some point, something impossible happened. Matter stopped being only matter. And became alive. The first cells emerged. Simple. Microscopic. Fragile. Yet they carried something revolutionary. The ability to survive. The ability to reproduce. The ability to pass information into the future. And for hundreds of millions of years, those microscopic organisms ruled the Earth alone. No forests. No fish. No dinosaurs. Only an invisible world fighting silent battles beneath the surface of ancient oceans. But then scientists discovered something unsettling. Those first cells may not have been alone. Because there is another possibility. What if something else appeared alongside life itself? Something smaller than cells. Something unable to live independently. Something that could only survive by entering another living thing. Viruses. Today, researchers still debate exactly when viruses first appeared. Some theories suggest viruses evolved after cells. Others propose something even more unsettling, that virus-like entities may have existed almost as long as life itself. If that idea is true, then viruses are not late arrivals in Earth's story. They were there near the beginning, waiting, changing, learning, long before humans, long before animals, long before history. And that creates a disturbing question. If viruses existed billions of years before humanity, then who was their first victim? Because every virus needs a host. And somewhere in the darkness of early Earth, someone or something was infected first. For most of human history, we believed viruses belonged to us. Our diseases, our epidemics, our fear. But that idea collapses the moment we look deeper into Earth's past. Because long before humans built cities, long before mammals walked the land, long before anything even remotely human existed, viruses were already moving through living worlds, crossing bodies, changing hosts, surviving extinctions. And if that sounds impossible, it may only be because we tend to imagine history beginning with ourselves. But life had already been running for billions of years before humanity ever arrived. And viruses had been there almost the entire time. Then came an age that still captures our imagination. An Earth ruled by giants. For more than 160 million years, dinosaurs dominated the planet. Massive predators, towering herbivores. Entire ecosystems unlike anything alive today. And for a long time, scientists imagined those ancient creatures lived in a world untouched by invisible disease. But that assumption has started to change. Modern research suggests that viruses or virus-like agents likely circulated through ancient animal populations millions of years ago. Not because viruses leave obvious fossils. They usually don't. But because evolution leaves signatures, fragments. Patterns hidden inside modern genomes. Scientists studying ancient evolutionary pathways have discovered evidence suggesting that some viral lineages may trace back incredibly deep into animal history. That means somewhere beneath ancient forests, inside feathered hunters, inside massive reptiles. Invisible biological battles may already have been happening, even in the age of giants. Nothing ruled alone. Then the world changed again. The age of dinosaurs ended. Entire ecosystems disappeared, but life survived. And among those survivors were small mammals, tiny, fragile, easy to overlook. Yet over millions of years, some of those creatures began changing. Eyes moved forward. Hands became more precise. Brains grew larger. The first primates appeared, our distant ancestors. And they did not enter an empty world. They inherited a world already occupied. Because viruses did not disappear with extinction. They adapted, they followed. Every generation of early primates carried more than genes. They carried invisible passengers. Some viruses learned to stay for weeks, others for years. Some for entire lifetimes. And a few may have remained for millions of years. That was the beginning of one of the longest wars in history. Not a war of weapons, a war of adaptation. Every time a virus mutated, the host responded. Every time the host built a defense, the virus searched for another way in mutation. Resistance, mutation, resistance, again, and again. Across millions of years. Most of those battles ended without witnesses, no records. No monuments, only survivors. And slowly, something extraordinary happened. The creatures that survived these invisible wars became stronger, more complex, more intelligent. Evolution was not happening alone. It had company. And then, after billions of years of oceans, after ancient viruses, after extinctions, after endless cycles of adaptation, Something appeared that had never existed before. A species that would reshape the planet. A species that would travel farther than any before it. A species that would eventually try to defeat viruses themselves, humans. But they were about to discover something terrifying. The invisible enemy had been waiting far longer than they had. For billions of years, the war continued without us. Viruses moved from host to host. Life evolved. Species appeared and disappeared. Entire worlds ended. And still, the invisible system remained in motion. Then, around 300,000 years ago, something unusual appeared. Not the strongest creature, not the fastest, not the largest. A species with fragile skin, weak teeth. No claws. No armor. But something else. Memory. Language. Curiosity. For the first time in Earth's history, a species emerged that could imagine the future. We call them Homo sapiens. And without realizing it, they were entering a world that had already been infected for millions of years. At first, humans did what humans have always done. They moved. They explored. They hunted. Small groups crossed valleys and grasslands, carrying fire, stone tools, and knowledge. Every meal meant survival. Every hunt meant another day alive. But hunting was never clean. Animals fought back. Bodies were opened. Skin was cut. Blood touched hands. Worn tissue met open wounds. And in those moments too ordinary to remember, something invisible may have crossed the boundary between species. Not with an explosion. Not with catastrophe. Quietly. One cell at a time. Today, scientists believe that many of the diseases affecting humans did not begin with us. They came from animals. This process has a name: zoonotic spillover. The movement of pathogens from one species into another. But for ancient humans, there was no name. Only fever, weakness, confusion, and survival. Imagine one evening, a hunting group returns. Someone has a cut on their hand. No one notices. They prepare food. Share water. Sleep close together. Nothing looks unusual. Then days pass. Someone becomes exhausted. Another develops a fever. One recovers. One doesn't. Nobody records the event. Nobody understands what happened. But if that infection adapted, if it learned to survive inside human cells, history may have changed forever. That possibility raises one of the strangest questions in human history. Who was the first human to ever carry a virus? Not the first epidemic, not the first pandemic, not the first person. One face, one body, one moment. Scientists cannot identify that first virus with certainty. Time erased the evidence. But several candidates continue to appear in scientific discussions. Some ancient viral families, such as herpes viruses, adenoviruses, and papillomaviruses, may have accompanied human ancestors for extremely long periods. Possibly long before modern civilization. Possibly before Homo sapiens itself. Some viruses do not arrive suddenly. They stay. They adapt. They become part of the background of life. Sometimes they become so old that generations stop noticing them, which means something unsettling. Some of the viruses inside modern humans may not be new invaders. They may be ancient companions. And somewhere in forgotten time, someone became infected. No monument remembers them. No language preserved their story. No grave tells us their name. Yet their encounter may have changed every generation that followed. The first human virus may have infected someone whose name will never be known. And that was only the beginning. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived like movement itself. They followed seasons, they followed water, they followed animals. Small groups crossed landscapes, rarely staying in one place for long. And without realizing it, This lifestyle created a natural barrier. If someone became sick, the group moved. If an infection appeared, distance often stopped it. Viruses survived, humans survived. Neither side truly won. Then, around 12,000 years ago, humanity made a decision that would quietly change the future forever. For the first time in history, we stopped moving. We call this transformation the Neolithic Revolution. But the people living through it would never have known they were creating a new world. They began planting instead of searching, building instead of wandering, staying instead of leaving. Villages appeared, then larger settlements. For the first time, generations lived and died in the same place. At first, it must have felt like victory. Food became more predictable. Children survived more often. Communities became stronger. This looked like progress. And it was. But every great human breakthrough creates new opportunities. Not only for us, for everything living beside us, including things we could not see. Because while humans believed they had conquered uncertainty, viruses saw something else. Hosts that no longer disappeared. Then humans made another decision. Instead of following animals, they brought animals home. Cattle, pigs, chickens. Species that had evolved separately for millions of years suddenly began sharing space with humans every single day. Animals slept nearby. They were fed nearby, handled nearby. Their blood touched tools. Their breath filled enclosed spaces. And for viruses, distance, the ancient obstacle, began disappearing. The barriers between species weakened. Every stable, every enclosure, every village became an experiment. Most of those invisible encounters failed. But evolution does not need success every time. Only once, one mutation. One adaptation, one successful crossing. And the rules change forever. Something extraordinary began to happen. For most of history, infections struggled to remain inside human groups. Now populations became larger, denser, more connected. More children. More contact, more opportunities. Humanity had accidentally built the perfect transmission network. Not roads, not cities, not trade. Those would come later. This was the first infrastructure, bodies. And viruses adapted immediately. Some learned to spread faster. Some learned to stay hidden. Some learned to move continuously through communities instead of disappearing. This was no longer survival. This was expansion. Today, scientists believe many of history's major infectious diseases became possible or dramatically expanded because of agriculture and close contact with domesticated animals. What looked like civilization also became an ecological turning point. Humans changed the rules, but they were not the only ones adapting. And from this moment on, viruses would no longer belong to isolated encounters in the wild. They would begin shaping civilizations, empires, trade routes, wars, and eventually, the entire world. For thousands of years, humans believed they were winning. Villages became cities. Cities became kingdoms. Kingdoms became empires. Stone became roads. Roads became trade. Trade became civilization. And with every generation, people became more certain of one thing. Humanity was taking control of the world. But hidden inside that success was something nobody understood. The same networks that moved ideas moved disease. The same roads that carried armies carried infection. The same crowded cities that made civilization possible created something viruses had never had before, unlimited opportunity. Humanity had not escaped the invisible enemy. It had connected itself to it. One of the earliest and most devastating examples was smallpox, a virus so powerful that for centuries it shaped the destiny of entire populations. Smallpox did not need speed. It needed contact. And civilization gave it exactly that. Crowded settlements. Families living together. Trade routes connecting distant worlds. People watched fever rise. Skin erupt. Entire communities change in weeks. Children grew up expecting loss. Rulers feared outbreaks. And long before humanity understood viruses, smallpox had already become one of history's greatest forces, not because it was intelligent, but because civilization made it efficient. Then came another lesson: measles, a virus that revealed something terrifying. Human civilization had become large enough to sustain diseases continuously. Unlike isolated infections that disappeared with small groups, measles thrived where people stayed connected. A settlement became a town. A town became a city. And suddenly, infection no longer ended. It circulated, returned, repeated. Generation after generation, people feared enemies at their borders. But the threat often arrived at home, through a door, through a breath, through someone they loved. And the more humanity grew, the stronger these invisible systems became. And then influenza demonstrated something even more dangerous: movement. Civilization had reached a new phase. People traveled. Armies marched. Merchants crossed continents. Animals moved with humans. And influenza adapted to movement itself. What once took generations could now happen in months. A disease no longer needed to stay where it began. It could travel farther than kings, faster than messages. Entire populations could be transformed before understanding what had happened. This was no longer a biological event. It was historical force. And history began leaving clues. Armies weakened before battle. Cities emptied. Migration patterns changed. Trade routes shifted. Conquests slowed. Some victories were decided not by strategy, but by immunity. Again and again, invisible outbreaks altered visible history. Empires rose. Empires fractured. People moved. Borders changed. Yet almost nobody understood the true enemy. Because how do you fight something you cannot see? By this point, humanity had crossed a line. Viruses were no longer visitors. They had become part of civilization itself. And for the first time in history, there was nowhere left to run. For most of history, the question would have sounded impossible. Who was infected first? Which virus crossed into humans before all others? Where did it happen? No ancient witness survived. No one wrote it down. No stone recorded the moment. And unlike bones, viruses do not leave behind skeletons. They disappear. They mutate. They erase themselves. For thousands of years, humanity had no way to look back. Then something changed. For the first time in history, we learned to search the past without traveling to it. Not with time machines, but with biology. Modern science discovered that every living body is also an archive. Inside every cell, inside every strand of DNA, there are records. Fragments. Messages from ancient worlds. When scientists began studying ancient genomes, they expected to find clues about migration, evolution, and ancestry. They found those, but they found something else too. Evidence that humans had never been alone. Because hidden inside our DNA are traces that do not belong to us, remnants left by ancient infections. Invisible signatures from encounters so old that they happened before recorded history. Suddenly, a disturbing possibility appeared. What if some of our oldest enemies never truly left? What if pieces of them remained inside us? Scientists sometimes describe these discoveries as viral fossils, not fossils made of stone, genetic fossils. Ancient viral material that became embedded into genomes and passed from generation to generation. Some of these remnants are called endogenous viral elements. And one of the most surprising discoveries in modern biology is this. Approximately 8% of human DNA appears to consist of ancient viral sequences. Think about that. A part of what makes us human may come from ancient viral encounters. Some of those viral traces entered our ancestors millions of years ago, long before cities, long before agriculture, long before history remembered us. Which means every person alive today carries echoes of battles they never fought. So can we identify the first human virus? Not yet. But scientists continue narrowing the possibilities. Some viral families appear unusually ancient. HERP, ESVIRUSEs, papillomaviruses, ancient retroviruses. Unlike fast-moving epidemic viruses, these may have accompanied human ancestors for extraordinary periods of time. Some may have crossed into early primates. Others may have evolved alongside our lineage. And that changes the question entirely. Maybe the first human virus was not a dramatic invasion. Maybe it was a relationship. A slow adaptation repeated across thousands of generations. So old that nobody noticed where it began. And that leaves us with one final mystery. We can sequence genomes, read ancient DNA. Search for viral fossils, reconstruct lost evolutionary paths. Yet even with all of modern science, there is still a moment hidden from us. A moment somewhere in deep time. One body. One crossing. One invisible beginning. Maybe we will discover it one day. Maybe we never will. But perhaps that is the strangest truth of all. The first human virus changed humanity forever. And we may never know its name. Now imagine that moment again. Not a laboratory. Not a hospital. Not a city. A cave. A fire burning against the cold. A small group of humans trying to survive another night. One of them is sick. At first, nobody thinks much of it. People become tired. People recover. People die. That is life. But this time, something is different. Something invisible has entered a body, and it has no intention of leaving. Maybe that person survived. Maybe they didn't. Maybe the virus disappeared with them. Or maybe it learned something new. Maybe it discovered how to move between humans. How to remain. How to spread. No witness understood what was happening. No one named the event. No one marked the day. But if that moment succeeded, if that invisible crossing continued, then one ordinary evening in forgotten history became one of the most important moments our species would ever experience. Because everything that came after every epidemic, every pandemic, every fear, every scientific breakthrough, every vaccine, every hospital, every attempt to understand disease, may trace part of its story back to that one invisible beginning. Human history remembers kings. It remembers wars. It remembers discoveries. But long before most of those things, there was a silent encounter between two forms of existence. One trying to survive, the other trying to survive too. We may never know who the first infected human was. We may never know where it happened. We may never know what they felt, whether they were afraid, whether they recovered, whether anyone remembered them. But we know this. The moment that virus crossed into a human body, a battle began, a battle carried through generations, across continents, across civilizations, a battle fought inside every century of human history. And even now inside laboratories, inside hospitals, inside our own cells. That story is still being written. So perhaps the question was never, what was the first human virus? Maybe the real question is this: after millions of years, after everything we have learned, after everything we have survived, have we ever truly stopped meeting it? Or are we still living in the age that began the day humanity first touched the invisible world? If this story made you look at humanity a little differently, if it made you realize that some of our oldest battles began long before history was written, then this journey is only beginning. Every week on this channel, we explore the hidden moments that shaped humanity, the questions nobody asked, the stories forgotten by time, and the discoveries that changed the world forever. So if you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us, what surprised you the most? And what hidden story should we uncover next? And if you want to continue exploring the moments that changed human history, watch the next documentary on your screen. Until then, take care of yourself, stay curious, stay healthy, and we'll see you in the next story.